This is Proxy Countdown. Welcome to the big show for the week of March 10th, 2025, alongside my tag team partner, Matt Scardy. I'm Damian Rollis. On today's countdown, CEOs getting raises for doing their jobs, Glass Lewis's nominating committee conundrum, Starbucks' lead director can't decide on his favorite coffee, a targeted vote against women at MyTech Systems, and on the big vote, Matt waxes poetic on ISS and Walt Disney. Let's start with our top stories on our trade wire. I've broken these down into different buckets this week, different problem buckets. The first one, the secret CEO raise for no particular reason problem. New compensation targets were established for Robert Sulentic at CBRE Group. In a nutshell, he is now eligible for $7 million more in compensation for no particular reason. And here's how they get to that point. They raise his base salary from $1.25 million to $1.35 million. They raise his annual target from $2.5 million to $2.7 million. And they raise his equity target from roughly $15 million to roughly $18 million. And when you remember that that's just the target amount and that he's eligible for basically 200% of all those figures, and you do the math, it means he's now suddenly eligible for $7 million just for continuing to do his job. All of this despite the fact that CBRE Group missed several important financial targets last year, including a core EPS target, a TSR target, and in fact, the annual bonus was only paid out 43% for financial performance because they missed so many targets.
The real question you should be asking here is the base salary increase, the annual target increase. They seem like sort of pennies, right? It
like
seems small. But it actually outpaces inflation. Inflation in 2024 was 2.9%. So it's not pennies. They're more than sort of doubling inflation. And they're nickel and diming their way to 7 million extra, effectively. The level of detail you have to pay attention to is exhausting. It's exhausting. It would make it impossible to do this at scale.
Same story at NASDAQ, where Chair and CEO Adena Friedman, she's entering into yet another employment agreement. So she entered into an employment agreement in 2022 that covered 2022 to 2027. Now it's still only 2025, but she's entered another employment agreement that goes to 2030. And I point that out because when she entered into her employment agreement in 2022, they gave her a one-time stock option grant worth $10 million. But here we go again. One of the big takeaways here is that her target equity award will not be less than $15 million. This is up from $12 million last year, meaning that her maximum award has gone from $24 million to $30 million. So again, all the little tricky, quiet ways that they really boost CEO pay, despite the fact that they don't tie it to actual performance of any kind. It's just CEO pay keeps going up.
Well, it is easy to untie it from performance when you have a will not be less than 15 million, right?
Yeah.
So that means if she is the worst in her entire industry, she still gets $15 million. Arguably, she gets it as an equity award cheaper because the stock is cheap, right? So it's sort of like a secret way to always make a lot of money.
The next category, I'm calling this the ongoing female director purge of 2025. Just something I've been noticing at several large cap companies that we're covering. First, Julia Brown is retiring at Molson Coors Beverage. Actually says, Matt, that she's retiring to devote more time to her global philanthropic work. You don't often see a flex like that. And maybe she's just ashamed, as I would be, that she got rich selling cheap beer. But you just don't see that kind of excuse. But the point here is that after she steps down on the Molson Coors board, there will be only 3 women with a total of 3% influence. 3% influence. Same thing going on at Viva Systems. Tina Hunt is stepping down. They'll only have 2 women left with a total of 7% influence. And likewise at Emerson Electric, Director Leticia Lorenzo is stepping down. They also will be down to only 2 women with 7% total influence. I think what you're seeing is that at boards where they really weren't interested in having diversity in the first place, they're going to start to quietly just kind of turn the clock backwards. That's my sense.
Honestly, the most interesting one on that list to me is Julia Brown, because she's devoting more time to her global philanthropic work. It doesn't quite understand how she joined the board 2 days ago of Guidewell Mutual Holding Corporation, which is an insurance company. So I know they're a nonprofit insurance company, but that's not exactly the global philanthropic work I'm guessing that we're talking about.
Not to mention that if you look at the data on freeflowanalytics.com, Molson Coors Beverage is packed with Molson and Coors family members that dominate the influence. I don't think that there were 14 people when she started to step down on that board. I don't think there was much effort going on by directors like Julia Brown in the first place, but that's a whole nother story. The next category, the ongoing why do they always stay around and mess up clear lines of leadership problem. Procore Technologies announced that founder and CEO Tui Courtemanche will stick around as the company's executive chair, so he's refusing to actually leave the company. Likewise, at Monster Beverage, co-CEO and board chair Rodney Sachs will step down as co-CEO, but will stay as board chair and really get the same compensation package. He'll do that until 2027, when he will no longer be an employee, but will stay on the board. So he's not going away either.
Is that really kind of the executive version of quiet quitting, where
I suppose, but again, what we've covered several times at various companies is that it doesn't do well for the next CEO. It either creates a possible boomerang CEO problem. It causes a muddled leadership. It just causes a lot of confusion in general. The next category is the ongoing, why do we need a pay plan when we start them off outside the pay plan problem? As an example, I'm talking about golden hello packages for new C-suite members. At Fortive, new CFO Mark Okerstrom is coming in with a one-time cash award of $2.5 million and a one-time sign-on equity award worth $10 million. So they start off plan. Why is everything started off plan?
Well, I'm assuming that doesn't include his moving bonus as well, which I'm sure is excessive.
And lastly, what I call the Glass-Lewis nomination committee problem. Las Vegas Sands is adding Mickey Pant as a new member of the board. Mickey will immediately start serving on the board's nominating committee. Now, Glass-Lewis announced recently that they were going forward, they're going to trust all nominating committees when it comes to diversity, which means that they implicitly trust Mickey and the entire Las Vegas Sands nominating committee just because they're on the nominating committee. And they're trusting a committee that has managed to appoint one woman to the board and she has only 6% influence. And this is the second director they've added since January. So they've had opportunities to add more women. But again, what Glass-Lewis is saying is that, well, hey, we're just going to trust the nominating committee to know what to do about diversity.
Also, to be clear here, Las Vegas Sands Mickey was not elected, right?
No.
Mickey was appointed.
Yes. Despite the language these companies use, yes, absolutely.
Not only are they immediately trusting him, but they're immediately trusting him without the acceptance of the investors yet.
Yeah.
Like, he can immediately begin nominating people.
Exactly. So that which proving that that announcement from Glass-Lewis was all just smoke and mirrors. It's just theater, right? There's no there. Let's move on to our proxy cage matches. There's not a lot to report. Whetstone Capital Advisors intends to nominate 2 directors at Optimize RX, but they didn't tell us who. But Matt, I ask you, does it matter? I mean, does it matter who the directors are anymore? Maybe it matters a bit more in proxy contests. Maybe that's when people actually pay attention to who the nominees are.
I'm not sure it does matter. I think what matters is the PowerPoint deck they put out in advance to investors about their why they took this position in the first place. Beyond that, I'm not sure anyone cares who they choose.
And then finally, a proxy cage match at Kenview. So Starboard Value pitched four nominees for Kenview's board, but then they created a cooperation agreement, which ultimately resulted in just adding one nominee, and that is Starboard CEO himself, Jeffrey Smith, to Kenview's board, which is interesting considering that the other people that Starboard nominated were all women. In fact, I think several of them were women of color, but Jeffrey Smith wins that battle. Kenview also did actually add two women last week to their board, Sarah Hofstetter and Erica Mann, but they don't have anything to do with Starboard Value. The other interesting part of this to me is this little footnote, is that under the Kenview Starboard agreement, Starboard will withdraw its proposed board member candidates, instead voting all of its roughly 22,000 shares in favor of each of Kenview's nominees. Now, Matt, I did the math. Last year, there were roughly 1.7 million votes cast at Kenview. 22,000 shares represents 0.001% of all the votes cast. So it's kind of it's a strange contest there. Jeffrey Smith basically just sort of muscled his way in despite having very little say, really.
Look, but I do have to say, I can't remember if it was on this show or one of our other shows. I heralded Starboard Value for finding, in an era where we discuss meritocracy and how, DEI is antithetical to meritocracy. Somehow Starboard managed to find multiple women, 3 women to nominate to this board, all of whom were eminently qualified when we looked at them, right?
Yeah.
I now feel a bit duped because it does seem that the 3 women were essentially a smokescreen for Jeffrey Smith to get on the board. I know the cooperation agreement was signed to add him, so Kenview and Starboard agree to it, but there wasn't room for them to add one of the women. Kenview added 2 of their own, which makes me think, okay, the 2 that they added are most likely connected to the Kenview board in some way already. There's already, so it becomes suspicious because they added them. What was wrong with Starboard's women? I feel like 8% duped here.
Okay. As you should be. Especially when the CEO of the entity is the only one who joins the board. But yeah, right, that the other 3 women are cast aside. That's it for the proxy cage matches. Moving over to the vote results table, here are the highlights from annual meetings over the past week. The big one was Starbucks. Not much going on, Matt. Only one director received more than 10% votes against. That's the lead independent director, Jorgen Vig Nudstorp. Matt, you compiled a list of all their favorite coffees over the past several years. I'm wondering if it's because he keeps changing his favorite coffee order. Ooh. Here's the 5 different choices he's made over the past few years: latte macchiato, a Pike Place Special Reserve, and then he switched it to a Pike Place Roast Americano. And then he switched it back to a Pike Place Special Reserve, but with a coffee press. And now he's at caramel macchiato. So maybe investors are getting sick of all the waffling. I
got to be honest. The most recent one, caramel macchiato, makes no sense here. Like the rest of those are pretty straight drinks. And now he's getting a little crazy.
14% said no to Say on Pay, which I would have thought would have been much higher considering the new CEO, Brian Nichols. He had his a pretty well-discussed pay package and a lot of business news over the past 6 months. He got a $96 million golden hello package, including the right to work from home when he felt like it, get flown into Seattle when he felt like it, despite the fact that he was requiring Starbucks workers to return to the office. So I would have thought investors would have been a bit more down on say on pay, but these days even 14% is a bit of a statement.
No, I think the real story here is 14% said no to pay, but no director got more than 10% votes against, which means they did not translate the say on pay vote to the no on comp committee vote.
Yeah, and I have more egregious examples of that later. Finally, at Starbucks, they had 5 shareholder proposals. Only one was taken somewhat seriously by shareholders, and that's the one asking for an independent board chair, which I think should be a no-brainer. Only 15% said yes to that one. The others failed miserably, including the now regular greatest hits of all the anti-woke political theater that we're seeing now at every major cap meeting. Moving on to analog devices, shareholders approved the amendments to the company's articles of organization, lowering the voting requirement for certain matters from a supermajority to a simple majority standard. Over 99% said yes to that. I can't understand what took them so long on this one. Imagine having super majority voting standard in 2025. That's utter nonsense. Sonos is a weird one. 39% of shareholders voted against Joanna Coles, but I just don't know why. I can't trace the reasoning. Doesn't make sense to me. Maybe it's because there are only 2 women on the board and she was the only director up for election who sits on the nominating committee. Is that possible, Matt? I don't understand. That's a high vote against. I just don't get it. Here's the other part that's weird at Sonos that you just pointed out. 44% said no on say on pay. That's an extremely high number. But the pay committee chair, Karen Boone, got 94% yes. I don't. That discrepancy makes absolutely no sense to me.
Well, I'm not sure what this vote is on either. None of the data supports it. But maybe the only reason why you vote against you can only choose one of woman at a time to vote no on. So they went with Karen Boone and they kept Joanna. They went after Joanna Coles.
That's a big vote, though. 39% is significant.
There's not a lot of logic here. I think that's the point.
No. And similarly, at My Tech Systems, another 42% said no to pay. Another one I really don't follow. So they actually have a CEO pay ratio of 36-1, Matt. That's like abnormally low. It's almost like absurdly low, right? In this day and age. I don't really understand what people are angry about. Last year, 36% said no, and supposedly the company listened to a ton of shareholder feedback to change the policies, but I guess none of that had an effect. And despite the fact that 42% said no on pay, none of the compensation committee members were targeted, so they're not blaming them, despite the fact that the overwhelming feedback on the pay plans was that it sucked and they needed to change it. The only thing I did see that was odd here at My Tech Systems is that the only directors that were targeted, there were 3 of them. All of them had more than 10% votes against. I think one was close to 20%. They were the only women on the board: Susan Repo, Kim Stevenson, and Donna Wells. So I don't really know what the hell's going on at My Tech Systems.
I don't know. I think there's an emerging trend, though. We're seeing significantly more votes against women in general. And I wonder if we keep tracking this, if it's going to unfold that any woman or person of color who is added to a board in the post George Floyd era is effectively being targeted as a DEI hire, regardless of their bona fides, which are all exceptional for in general,
almost embarrassingly exceptional. And finally. Is this a prediction of what's going to happen at Tesla, Matt? At Sidious Pharmaceuticals, and Hepion Pharmaceuticals, there were high votes against pretty much everything, and basically it's due to a bad share price. So is that what's going to happen at Tesla, Matt? The share price is so bad that even JP Morgan's making fun of it. Do you think investors will finally vote against something at Tesla this year?
I don't think so.
No. I knew they wouldn't. I just threw that in there. That's all I got. Let's move over to the big vote for this week. By far, the big ticket company up for a vote this next week on March 20th, that's next Thursday, is Walt Disney. Matt, I know you have a lot to say about this, so go ahead, take it away.
Yeah, so I spent my time on Disney, although Qualcomm is also up for a vote on March 18th. So and they're equally as big. We did a review of Qualcomm last year, and a lot of what we thought of last year still stands because the addition to the board didn't actually fill our needs. So if you want to know what we thought about Qualcomm, you can listen to last year's. But I think Disney's worth revisiting because this year we do not have an activist at Disney.
We had two activists last time, right?
Last year we had two activists, and it was headline generating for months, multiple months. Everybody weighed in, from Bill Ackman to Elon Musk to President Trump to Governor DeSantis. Like everyone was weighing in on Disney and the activists. Nelson Peltz was one of those activists. He was weighing in on everything from the board at Disney and had reasonable criticisms of Disney, and also weighing in on why there was too many black people in Disney films, why we needed them all. It was a crazy time.
No joke, yeah.
This year, not so much. This year, Disney's board is roughly the same. So just for reference, Disney's board last year had Francis D'Souza on it and also had Mark Parker on it. This year, we have the only differences are Jeremy Derrick is on it, James Gorman is on it. So this year, effectively, the board is largely unchanged from last year. There's two differences. Those differences actually happened during the fight. Derrick and Gorman joined during the proxy fight for the most part. So not a lot to sort of focus on from a board construction standpoint. But what I do want to focus on is proxy recommendations.
Okay.
I very specifically want to focus on ISS.
Sure.
ISS's report in 2024, I'm going to read a bit of their report from 2024 into this. They targeted, they said, vote Peltz onto the board, and they wanted to vote withhold, this is a recommendation, on the longest serving, this is quote, the longest serving independent member of the board, Lagomasino, who is Maria Lagomasino. It says, quote, Lagomasino bears more responsibility than any other serving nominee for the failure of the Stag's Rasulo bake-off, the failure to cultivate a readily apparent successor to Iger following Stag's departure, and again following Iger's re-entry.
Right. Wow.
They blamed Lagomasino for the succession plan failure at Disney. They also say this.
Wait, was she the chair of the nomination committee? Why did she get the...
Susan Arnold was the chair of the nomination committee.
Okay.
And their focus on Lagomasino, they added a couple of layers here. Peltz is the one who focused on Lagomasino, not ISS. ISS basically was agreeing or disagreeing with Peltz. Because also on the nominating committee at the time was Derica Rice, who is currently not on the nominating committee, but he was on the board during the activist campaign, right? So Derica Rice, Maria Lagomasino, and Susan Arnold were there for the Chapek pick, the poor Chapek pick, the Stags, overlooking Stags. But they did not go after Derica Rice. They went after Maria Lagomasino.
Despite the fact that Derica Rice is quite a busy director, he sits on the boards of Bristol Myers Squibb, Target, Carlyle Group, and Walt Disney. Those are big cap companies.
They did not care about him at all. Peltz did not choose to care about him. But they include as reasons to vote withhold on Lagomasino that so the succession planning but also the fact that she was a member of the compensation committee since joining the company, and she was the chair of it since 2019. She oversaw, quote, consecutive years of problematic compensation decisions, resulting in significant shareholder opposition, which the committee failed to promptly address.
Yeah.
They targeted her because she was, quote, the longest tenured independent director and a member of these two committees. She arguably bears more accountability than most for the failed succession. Basically,
I'm okay with a lot of this, Matt. I would have voted against her myself. I think I probably did recommend that.
I don't disagree in a lot of respects with their analysis. They said they wrapped up by saying shareholders are recommended to vote for Nelson Peltz. I did disagree with that.
I did not agree with, no.
And withhold votes from Jay Rasulo, Blackwell's nominees, and withhold from Maria Elena Lagomasino.
Yeah, Jay Rasulo, the former CFO of Walt Disney, like back in 1940, I think.
So fast forward 1 year today, there is no activist at Disney. And here's the headline. Proxy advisor ISS supports Disney board 1 year after the fight.
The entire board.
The current reporting, and this is, I've heard this from people who have access to the report itself for what ISS is recommending, and this is based on a number of policies. So it's not just their one policy. ISS is recommending voting for the entire board at Disney.
Wow. But no, I will add that one thing that has changed since last year is that the Disney share price is down 12%.
So let's go point by point here, right? Let's see if anything has changed except for the ISS recommendation, because ISS's whole recommendation is effectively built on three pillars, which are succession planning, which are compensation issues, and which are underperformance of the stock during this tenure, because Nelson Peltz pointed out underperformance of this entire board during their tenures. So starting with succession planning, they added James Gorman. James Gorman was the CEO at Morgan Stanley, successfully successed himself, I suppose. How would you think about that?
Which is not the role. It's not the role of the CEO's job is not to create his own succession planning, though.
Correct. It's the nominating committee's job to do the succession planning. James Gorman was added to this board, not the nominating committee of Morgan Stanley.
Yeah. I will say, Matt, that the love of James Gorman here is kind of a sad look at our current anti-DEO world, where I think just because of the fact that he's a white man from Morgan Stanley, that he represents this something called quote unquote merit, right? So they're just saying he's good, that he's a great choice, he knows what he's doing. Right? I mean, isn't that basically what we're talking about?
Ostensibly, that seems to be ISS. ISS has not articulated this in anything that I've seen, but ostensibly what's happening here is Gorman means succession is taken care of, which means...
I don't really know how, but yeah.
By extension, Lagomasino can't do any succession damage. If you thought she was responsible for the succession plan failure, having Gorman take care of this now means she can't do damage.
But she's still the longest tenured director. She still has the second highest influence, according to freeflowanalytics.com, right behind Bob Iger. So she's still a powerful voice there. So ostensibly, she's actually going to have quite a bit to say about succession planning at Disney still.
Well, so here's the Free Float take on this. Free Float, I believe Gorman is a succession smokescreen. It is still very much Iger picking. In fact, the data shows that Gorman is a friendly, not a dissenter. Gorman, when he joined the board, became the single most interconnected director on the entire board. He is involved in 42 distinct loops to other directors on this board. He outpaces Mary Barra's 40 loops to the other directors. We know this board. In fact, it was written up in last year's activist campaigns. This board is handpicked by Iger. It was in every media article. Iger handpicks his own board. Iger actually has fewer traceable connections to other board members than Gorman does. And that includes through nonprofit boards, which we added this in the last month. We added nonprofit boards. Without nonprofit boards, 6 of the 10 board members are connected in some way. With the nonprofit boards, 9 out of 10 are connected, but really it's 10 out of 10, given that Michael Froman, who's still on the board, he actually was put as the president and a board member of the Council of Foreign Relations in 2023. They haven't filed their taxes for 2023 yet, but he's connected to James Gorman through the Council on Foreign Relations. There is very clearly a Gorman problem, not a solution. And that is Gorman is highly compromised by his relationships with other directors on this board.
Not to mention, Matt, that we've covered several succession at media companies. We've covered several proxy contests at media companies. We've covered the boards of several media companies. The corporate governance beast at media companies is nothing like the Morgan Stanley that he came from. Nothing.
Yeah. I would argue that the succession plan is not solved. So if that is like part of ISS's recommendation to vote for all these directors, it is not solved in any way, shape, or form. In fact, it might just be a smokescreen solution. So point number 2, Lagomasino's tenure and her underperformance during that tenure. Not only does Lagomasino warrant a vote against, by those justifications, virtually the entire board should be voted against. If you look at tenure, Lagomasino absolutely is the longest tenured. She's the second most influential, to your point. Gorman doesn't even come in third. He comes in fourth.
Behind Mary Barra, right.
But is ISS recommending voting against all directors with 8 years of tenure on underperforming boards? Because that does not seem to be the case. When you update Peltz's director performance chart, every director on this board underperformed relative to the S&P 500 in the last year, which means for their entire tenures of every member of this board, they all underperform. Every single one of them by Peltz's chart. That's just by Peltz's chart. By our own data, the bottom 3 TSR performers isn't actually Lagomasino. It's Froman, Derrick, and Barra. Iger, Barra, and Froman are the worst for earnings. The members of this board, by most measures, are either average or underperforming. So is ISS's recommendations now that you vote for underperformance everywhere unless an activist is involved? It's very confusing because nothing has changed from a performance standpoint at all.
I mean, in fact, I remember in our original take on ISS last year was that they only voting against one director wasn't even enough. Like why would they cherry picked her and didn't target a bunch of them? It didn't make sense. But now that they're reversing on her, equally doesn't make sense.
It makes less sense now.
Yeah, and not to mention that you mentioned egregious pay. There is one figure I just wanted to point out is that the CEO pay ratio. We laugh at CEO pay ratio all the time. If it especially when it goes above this 365 to 1 pay ratio, which means that the CEO's earning median pay in the first day. Bob Iger's is 746 to 1. So, I mean, you don't get much more egregious than that. I mean, that's just crazy.
I mean, so let's get to the pay question entirely, right? So, egregious pay, Iger actually, in the last year, we just talked about underperformance. Iger in the last year got a 30% increase in his summary compensation after underperforming the S&P 500 for this year.
Right.
In fact,
stock price down. Mm-hmm.
In fact, according to free float data, as of the end of 2023, which is the last time we ran this particular data point, we look at CEO pay and directors who pay the most relative to CEO pay ratio. Which directors pay the highest CEO pay ratios in the industries where they sit on boards? None. This is real data. None of the Disney directors have ever paid a CEO of any board they've ever been on below average pay. Huh. Every single one of them pay above average. In fact, every board that Mary Barra has been on, the CEOs are paid in the top 98% of all peer CEOs.
Wow.
Safra Katz, who's the best on this board, paid CEOs in the 72nd percentile on every board she's ever sat on. So Lagomasino is the head of the comp committee still, and guess who's replacing her at this AGM? Mary Barra, the worst performer for CEO pay on the board.
Well, not to mention one of the busiest CEOs in the world. So I guess it makes sense to put her on a committee where she doesn't really have to do much.
So, but
other
if
than
you
just
look
like
at,
raise the numbers.
if you look at the justification here, if ISS is flipping their vote, are they flipping their vote because now they are going to vote for CEOs getting a raise every single year? Is this what is the vote? Like what is the flip here for? Because the pay is still incredibly egregious at this company by virtually every metric. So if they're going to vote against the pay package, shouldn't they vote against the nom chair also, who is Lagomasino now and will be Barra? Overall, here's the take. Not only does every ISS justification still apply today, in fact, we were right last year. It applies to everyone on this board. This board broadly underperforms. It underperformed before Peltz. It underperformed after Peltz.
Sure. It's only been a year.
So I actually think you should repudiate this entire board.
Okay.
I think you should vote no on every single director. And you should ask better of ISS. Why are you flipping your vote? You were right about at least one director last year. You're not less right this year. Just because there's not an activist involved does not mean you should stop paying attention.
You know, at a minimum, Matt, this is the perfect use case of my belief that we got to start getting American CEOs off their boards. If you have a major succession planning problem, one that's so big that even normal news talks about it, then I would suggest absolutely voting Bob Iger off this board. Bob Iger is still going to be absolutely the most powerful person at Walt Disney. But why should he even be sitting on the board that's trying to figure out what to do with him when he leaves? Like it doesn't make any sense to me.
So that's my recommendation. And I think you actually need to start to ask. You need to start asking ISS questions about how
Everything.
are you making these recommendations at all? Because clearly there's not data. I know the Special Solutions Group was involved when an activist was doing it, and now it's your regular analysts. But there needs to be some sort of justification for flipping your vote back to voting for this entire board.
That's exactly what I was going to say. It's one thing to just have no opinion and just vote for everyone. It's another thing to 12 months ago you're saying vote her out, and then 12 months later nothing has changed, and you're saying okay, she's fine now. That suggests that something is a little bit screwy over at ISS.
I also briefly looked at the Disney shareholder proposals. I don't think there's much to report here except a bunch of the same anti-woke stuff. I didn't want to get into Boyer Research has one about ad buyers and sellers, which is totally bizarre because they're suggesting that Disney should be advertising on every platform, regardless if they agree with the content on that platform, or otherwise they're discriminating in some way against the users of those platforms. But what's interesting to me about the Boyer Research one was not the content of it, because it's patently absurd. It was that the who they do it on behalf of. We already covered last week or 2 weeks ago that they chose on behalf of a person that I could not find in any record anywhere. Not Social Security records, mortgage records, no phone numbers, no voting records. And I looked everywhere that I could. And this week they chose someone. The only person I could find whose name matched is a real estate agent based in Texas. And I actually reached out to that person and got no response. I'm not clear whether or not they are.
What's her name? Dana Tuggle?
Dana Tuggle was her name. And I am not clear whether they're fictionalizing the on behalf ofs or finding anyone somewhere who's sort of blindly willing to just say, sure, whatever.
Well, the argument's absurd in the first place, so they might be making it up. Let's not forget that the reason why Walt Disney and a lot of similar companies, media companies like Walt Disney, were pulling out of Twitter was because they were finding that their advertisements were showing up right next to the accounts of neo-Nazis, white supremacists. Like, that's not a good look if you're also trying to sell movies about fish, about little animated fish swimming around. So the whole concept behind what Boyer Research is asking for is bizarre in the first place. Not to mention, where's Exxon CEO Darren Woods he likes to sue investors. He should sue Boyer Research for wasting the time at Disney with this kind of crap. I don't know what's going on.
So those are my suggestions. Vote against the board. You can vote against. Anytime Jim McRitchie has a shareholder proposal or John Chevedden has a shareholder proposal, I'm pro them in general. But for the most part, vote against the shareholder proposals. I don't know if you have anything to add about the other companies. Anything popped for you?
No, the two things that popped for me the most was the absurd CEO pay ratio at Walt Disney, 746-1. I also like that at Construction Partners, they actually had a low CEO pay ratio and it's very precise, 64.6-1. But I will end on this: the problem at Construction Partners, and this is maybe the lowest I've ever seen. They have one woman on their board who has a total of 1% influence. I've just never seen anything so absurdly low. So, but other than that, I agree with you on Disney, and I don't have anything else. Anything else to add before we wrap up, Matt?
That's it.
That's the Proxy Countdown for the week of March 10th, 2025. Join us next week when we jump back into the alternative democracy pool, forever on the lookout for shareholder shenanigans, dopey directors, and scandalous CEO pay ratios.